The forensic technician lifted the plastic evidence bag toward the fluorescent light, and inside it, frozen in time for 37 years, was a single strand of hair still clinging to fabric that had once been pale blue cotton. The room went silent. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The winter of 1987 arrived early in Middleton Township, New Jersey, a bedroom community of 8,000 residents nestled between the Pine Barrens and the sprawling suburbs that fed commuters into Philadelphia. Thanksgiving had passed quietly that year, and by the first week of December, snow had blanketed the region in a way that felt both festive and isolating. The streets were lined with colonial homes, their porches decorated with wreaths and electric candles, and the local high school had just wrapped its annual holiday concert. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where the police blotter rarely reported anything more serious than a fender bender or a noise complaint. That sense of safety shattered on December 9th when 22-year-old Rachel Diane Curran failed to show up for her shift at the Middleton Public Library. Rachel had graduated from Rutgers University the previous spring with a degree in English literature. She had returned home to save money while applying to graduate programs, and she worked part-time at the library, a modest brick building on Elm Street that smelled of old paper and floor polish. Her coworkers described her as reliable, warm, and quietly ambitious. She lived with her parents in a 2-story house on Birchwood Lane, a treeland street where kids still rode bikes without supervision and families left their doors unlocked. On the evening of December 8th, Rachel told her mother she was meeting a friend for coffee at a diner near the Route 70 interchange. She left the house just after 6 in the evening, wearing jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and a navy parka. She carried a leather purse and drove her father's silver Honda Accord. She never came home. Her mother, Janet Curran, called the police at 11 that night. The responding officer took a report but suggested Rachel might have stayed over with a friend or lost track of time. By the next morning, when Rachel missed her library shift and still had not called, the Curran family knew something was wrong. Her father, Thomas Curran, a structural engineer, began calling hospitals while Janet contacted everyone in Rachel's address book. None of her friends had seen her. The diner near Route 70 had no record of her being there, and the friend Rachel supposedly planned to meet told police she had never made such plans. The Honda Accord was found late that afternoon in the parking lot of a shuttered textile mill on the outskirts of town, 2 miles from the diner. The doors were locked, the keys were missing, and there was no sign of Rachel. The Middleton Police Department launched a missing person investigation. Detectives canvassed the area around the mill, interviewed employees from nearby businesses, and reviewed the sparse traffic along that stretch of road. The mill had closed in 1982, leaving behind a crumbling complex of red brick buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing. It was a place teenagers sometimes used for parties, but in December, in the cold, it was deserted. There were no witnesses, no surveillance cameras, and no physical evidence inside or around the vehicle. Rachel's purse was gone. Her wallet, identification, and house keys were missing. The only item left behind was a scarf she kept in the backseat. Search parties formed within days. Volunteers from the community, along with state police and cadaver dogs, combed the woods surrounding the mill and the frozen marshland that edged the Pine Barrens. The temperature hovered in the 20s, and snow continued to fall intermittently, covering tracks and complicating efforts. Local newspapers ran front-page stories. Rachel's senior portrait appeared on telephone poles and in shop windows. Her family held a press conference, pleading for information. The investigation grew to include the New Jersey State Police Major Crime Unit, and a tip line was established. Calls came in, but most led nowhere. Some reported seeing a young woman matching Rachel's description at a rest stop. Others claimed to have seen unfamiliar vehicles near the mill. None of the leads produced concrete evidence. On December 23rd, 2 weeks after Rachel disappeared, a pair of hunters discovered her body in a densely wooded area approximately 6 miles southeast of the mill. The location was remote, accessible only by a narrow dirt access road used occasionally by utility workers. Snow had drifted over the site, and the body was partially concealed beneath pine branches that appeared to have been deliberately placed. The medical examiner determined that Rachel had been deceased for at least 10 days, likely since the night she vanished. The cause of death was asphyxiation, and there were signs of a struggle. Her clothing was intact but disheveled. Her jewelry, a small gold necklace and a wristwatch, were still present, ruling out robbery as a motive. The purse and car keys were never recovered. The discovery devastated the Curran family and sent shockwaves through Middleton Township. The holidays that year were marked by grief and fear. Parents kept their children closer. Doors that had once been left unlocked were bolted. The police intensified their efforts, conducting hundreds of interviews and pursuing every conceivable angle. Detectives focused on individuals who had access to the area where the body was found, including utility workers, hunters, and anyone with a criminal history in the region. They looked into Rachel's personal life, interviewing classmates, former professors, and acquaintances from Rutgers. There were no signs of stalking, no threatening letters, no jilted romantic interests. Rachel had been well liked, with no known enemies. Forensic evidence from the scene was limited. Trace evidence collected from Rachel's clothing included fibers that did not match anything in her wardrobe or her home. Soil samples and plant material were analyzed, but provided no definitive links. The technology available in 1987 was primitive by modern standards. DNA analysis was still in its infancy, and the evidence collected was stored in the hope that future advancements might yield answers. The investigation continued through the winter and into 1988, but leads dried up. The case began to fade from the headlines, though it never left the minds of those who knew Rachel or had followed her story. For the Curran family, the years that followed were defined by an absence that could not be filled. Janet Curran became an advocate for victims' families, attending support groups and speaking at events. Thomas Curran lobbied for better resources for cold case investigations. Rachel's younger brother, Michael, pursued a career in criminal justice, motivated in part by the unresolved nature of his sister's death. The case file remained open, but as decades passed, it grew colder. Detectives retired, evidence was archived, and Middleton Township moved forward, though the memory of Rachel Curran lingered like a shadow. In 2018, the New Jersey State Police announced the formation of a dedicated cold case unit, equipped with modern forensic tools and access to national databases. The unit began systematically reviewing unsolved homicides from the 1980s and 90s, prioritizing cases where biological evidence had been preserved. Rachel Curran's case was among the first to be re-examined. The original evidence, stored in a climate-controlled facility, included clothing, fingernail scrapings, and several unidentified hairs found on Rachel's sweater. Advances in DNA technology, particularly the use of genetic genealogy, had revolutionized cold case investigations in recent years, and the team hoped these tools might finally provide answers. The evidence was sent to a private forensic laboratory specializing in genetic analysis, and the painstaking work of building a profile began. The DNA extraction process took months. The biological material recovered from Rachel Curran's clothing had degraded significantly over 3 decades, and the laboratory technicians worked with samples that contained only partial genetic markers. By late 2019, They had developed a profile suitable for upload to genealogical databases, platforms where millions of people had submitted their DNA in search of ancestral connections. The process involved comparing the unknown profile against these databases to identify potential relatives of the person who had left the DNA on Rachel's sweater. It was tedious work that required collaboration between forensic scientists and genetic genealogists who specialized in building family trees from fragmented information. The breakthrough came in January 2020. A match appeared in the database, indicating a third cousin relationship to the unknown donor. The genetic genealogist assigned to the case, a woman named Dr. Helena Marsh, who had worked on several high-profile cold cases, began constructing a family tree. She traced lineages backward through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries, mapping out branches that might lead to the person whose DNA had been found at the crime scene. The work was meticulous. Each branch of the tree had to be verified through multiple sources, and Dr. Marsh often found herself navigating gaps in records or discrepancies in names and dates. By March, she had narrowed the possibilities to a cluster of families with roots in southern New Jersey, specifically in Burlington County, which bordered the area where Rachel's body had been discovered. The State Police Cold Case Unit took over from there, working closely with Dr. Marsh to identify individuals within the family tree who would have been adults in 1987 and who had connections to Middleton Township or the surrounding region. The list of potential suspects was initially broad, encompassing more than 30 individuals across several generations. Detectives began the process of elimination, cross-referencing names against driver's license records, employment histories, and criminal databases. They were looking for men between the ages of 20 and 50 in 1987 who had lived or worked in the area. They also considered factors such as access to vehicles, familiarity with the terrain where Rachel's body was found, and any prior history of violence or sexual offenses. By June 2020, the list had been reduced to 6 names. Each of these individuals became the subject of intensive background investigations. Detectives reviewed old case files, contacted former neighbors and employers, and searched for any connections, however tenuous, to Rachel Curran or her family. They looked for patterns, criminal records, and alibis. The process was slow, complicated by the passage of time, and the fact that some of the individuals had died or moved out of state. The investigation was further delayed by the onset of the pandemic, which restricted travel and limited access to certain records. But the team pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that the Curran family had waited more than 30 years for answers. The name that eventually rose to the top of the suspect list was Kenneth Paul Dwyer, a 68-year-old man living in a small ranch house in Pemberton Township, about 15 miles from Middleton. In 1987, Dwyer had been 31 years old, employed as a maintenance worker for the County Parks Department. His job had required him to travel throughout Burlington County, including areas near the Pine Barrens where Rachel's body had been found. Detectives discovered that Dwyer had been questioned briefly during the original investigation because a coworker had reported seeing him near the shuttered textile mill around the time Rachel disappeared. The interview notes from 1987 indicated that Dwyer had provided an alibi, claiming he had been home with his then-wife on the evening of December 8th. His wife had corroborated the story, and without physical evidence linking him to the crime, investigators had moved on. The cold case team decided to take a closer look at Dwyer. They learned that his marriage had ended in divorce in 1991, and his ex-wife had since remarried and moved to Florida. Detectives contacted her in August 2020. She agreed to speak with them, and during a lengthy phone interview, she made a statement that changed the trajectory of the investigation. She admitted that she had lied about Kenneth's whereabouts on the night of December 8, 1987. She said he had not been home that evening and had returned after midnight, agitated and unwilling to explain where he had been. She claimed she had provided the false alibi out of fear, stating that Kenneth had a volatile temper and that she had been afraid of him. She also revealed that in the months following Rachel's disappearance, Kenneth had become increasingly paranoid, burning papers in their backyard and insisting they avoid discussing the case even in private. This revelation gave investigators the probable cause they needed to pursue Kenneth Dwyer more aggressively. In September, detectives obtained a court order to collect a DNA sample from him. They conducted surveillance and waited for an opportunity. On a Thursday afternoon, Dwyer was observed discarding a coffee cup in a public trash receptacle outside a convenience store in Pemberton. The cup was retrieved and sent to the forensic laboratory. Within 2 weeks, the results came back. The DNA profile from the cup was a match to the profile developed from the evidence found on Rachel Curran's clothing. The certainty was overwhelming, with a statistical probability that excluded all but an infinitesimal chance of coincidence. Armed with this evidence, the state police assembled a case file and presented it to the Burlington County Prosecutor's Office. On October 14, 2020, an arrest warrant was issued for Kenneth Paul Dwyer on charges of murder, kidnapping, and hindering apprehension. The arrest took place early the following morning. Dwyer was taken into custody without incident at his home. Detectives also executed a search warrant, seizing computers, documents, and personal items. Among the materials recovered was a box containing newspaper clippings about Rachel Curran's case, dating from 1987 and 1988. The clippings had been carefully preserved, a chilling indication that Dwyer had followed the investigation and its eventual descent into silence. The arrest sent shockwaves through Middleton Township and the surrounding communities. Residents who had lived through the original case were stunned to learn that a suspect had finally been identified. Local news outlets ran extensive coverage, and the story was picked up by regional and national media. For the Curran family, the news brought a complex mixture of relief, grief, and anger. Janet Curran, now in her 70s, released a statement through the prosecutor's office, expressing gratitude to the investigators who had never given up on Rachel's case. She also spoke of the pain of knowing that the person responsible had been living freely for more than 3 decades, just miles from where her daughter had been taken. Kenneth Dwyer's arraignment was held in late October. He appeared in court wearing an orange jumpsuit, flanked by a public defender. He entered a plea of not guilty. Bail was denied, and he was remanded to the Burlington County Jail to await trial. As the legal process unfolded, prosecutors began building their case. In addition to the DNA evidence, they gathered testimony from Dwyer's ex-wife, employment records that placed him in the vicinity of both the textile mill and the wooded area where Rachel's body was found, and the newspaper clippings that suggested an obsessive interest in the case. They also consulted forensic psychologists to analyze Dwyer's behavior in the years following the crime. The investigation took an unexpected turn in December when detectives began looking into whether Dwyer might be connected to other unsolved cases. His work with the County Parks Department had given him access to remote areas across southern New Jersey, and his employment records showed he had been active in the region throughout the 1980s and 90s. Investigators reviewed cold cases involving young women from that period, searching for similarities in methodology or location. While no definitive links were established, the possibility remained under investigation. The trial was scheduled for March 2021, but was delayed multiple times due to procedural motions and the backlog created by pandemic-related court closures. It finally commenced in September 2021, nearly 4 years after the cold case unit had first reopened Rachel Curran's file. The proceedings took place in the Burlington County Courthouse, a stately building in Mount Holly where the weight of history seemed to press down on everyone who entered. The courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and members of the Curran family. Janet Curran attended every day of the trial, seated in the front row, her expression stoic but her eyes betraying the decades of anguish she had carried. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They began by walking the jury through the events of December 1987, using photographs, maps, and timelines to reconstruct Rachel's final hours. They presented testimony from the original investigators, now retired, who described the initial search efforts and the discovery of her body. The medical examiner who had performed the autopsy in 1987, now elderly but still sharp, testified about the cause of death and the injuries Rachel had sustained. He explained that the evidence suggested she had been restrained and that her death had occurred within hours of her disappearance. His testimony was clinical, but the facts he presented were harrowing. The DNA evidence formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Dr. Helena Marsh, the genetic genealogist, took the stand and explained in clear, accessible terms how she had used genetic databases and family tree reconstruction to identify Kenneth Dwyer as a suspect. Her testimony was bolstered by forensic scientists from the laboratory who had analyzed the biological material and confirmed the match. They presented statistical analyses showing that the probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Dwyer was less than 1 in several trillion. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of genetic genealogy as a technique, arguing that it was relatively new and untested in court. But the judge ruled the evidence admissible, citing precedents from other jurisdictions where similar methods had been successfully employed. Dwyer's ex-wife, now 64 years old and visibly nervous, provided some of the trial's most compelling testimony. She recounted the night of December 8, 1987, describing how Kenneth had left the house around 5 in the evening, claiming he needed to check on equipment at one of the parks. She said he had not returned until well after midnight, and when he did, he had been disheveled and uncommunicative. She testified that in the days and weeks that followed, his behavior had become erratic. He had insisted they burn old documents, including receipts and notes, and he had grown angry whenever Rachel Curran's case was mentioned on the news. She admitted that she had been afraid of him and had lied to protect herself and their young son. Her voice cracked as she described the guilt she had lived with for 34 years, knowing she might have provided information that could have helped the investigation. The prosecution also introduced the newspaper clippings found in Dwyer's home. Forensic document examiners testified that the clippings had been carefully cut and stored, suggesting deliberate preservation. A forensic psychologist took the stand to discuss what these clippings might indicate about Dwyer's state of mind. She explained that offenders sometimes keep mementos or follow media coverage of their crimes, deriving satisfaction from the attention, or using the information to reassure themselves that they have not been caught. The psychologist was careful not to overreach, but her testimony painted a picture of someone who had remained psychologically invested in Rachel's case long after the investigation had gone cold. The defense's strategy was limited. They could not dispute the DNA evidence, so they focused instead on creating doubt about how the DNA had ended up on Rachel's clothing. They suggested the possibility of contamination or transfer, arguing that Dwyer's work might have brought him into innocent contact with Rachel or locations she had frequented. They called their own expert witness, a forensic scientist who testified about the potential for secondary transfer of DNA, but the prosecution's rebuttal was strong. The amount and location of the DNA on Rachel's sweater, they argued, was inconsistent with innocent transfer and instead indicated direct physical contact during a struggle. Dwyer himself did not testify. His attorney advised against it, likely fearing that cross-examination would expose inconsistencies or reveal damaging information. The defense rested after presenting a brief case, and closing arguments began on a cold afternoon in late September. The prosecution emphasized the clarity of the evidence, the corroboration provided by Dwyer's ex-wife, and the decades of grief endured by the Curran family. The defense urged the jury to consider the limitations of evidence that was more than 30 years old, and to question whether the state had truly proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the morning of September 30th, they returned with a verdict. Kenneth Paul Dwyer was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and hindering apprehension. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. Janet Curran closed her eyes and bowed her head. Her son Michael, seated beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. When the judge dismissed the jury and adjourned the proceedings, reporters rushed from the courtroom to file their stories. The conviction was front-page news across New Jersey and was covered by national outlets that had been following the case. Sentencing took place in November. New Jersey had abolished the death penalty in 2007, so Dwyer faced life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Before the sentence was handed down, the judge allowed Janet Curran to deliver a victim impact statement. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She described Rachel as a bright, compassionate young woman whose life had been stolen just as it was beginning. She spoke of the holidays that had been shadowed by grief, the milestones Rachel would never experience, and the hole that her absence had left in their family. She looked directly at Dwyer and said she hoped he would spend every remaining day of his life thinking about what he had taken. The judge sentenced Kenneth Paul Dwyer to life in prison without parole, adding consecutive sentences for the kidnapping and hindering charges to ensure he would never be released. Dwyer showed no visible reaction as the sentence was pronounced. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs and transported to New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he would spend the remainder of his days. His attorney filed an appeal in early 2022, challenging the admissibility of the genetic genealogy evidence and arguing that the prosecution had not adequately demonstrated the chain of custody for the DNA samples collected in 1987. The appeal was denied in August 2022, with the appellate court affirming the conviction and praising the investigative work that had finally brought resolution to the case. For the Curran family, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of a 34-year ordeal, but it did not erase the pain. Janet Curran gave several interviews in the months following the sentencing, speaking about the importance of cold case investigations and the role that advances in forensic science had played in solving Rachel's murder. She expressed gratitude to the detectives who had refused to let the case remain forgotten, and she emphasized that justice, however delayed, still mattered. She also acknowledged the complicated emotions that came with closure. There was relief in knowing that Rachel's killer had been identified and would never harm anyone else, but there was also the inescapable reality that Rachel was gone and would not be coming back. The conviction could not undo the loss or restore what had been taken. Michael Curran, who had become a criminal investigator in part because of his sister's case, spoke publicly about how the resolution had affected him. He described the surreal experience of sitting in the courtroom and watching the legal system finally hold someone accountable for a crime that had defined his childhood and adolescence. He said that for years he had carried anger and frustration, not just at the person who killed Rachel, but at the seeming randomness of the universe that had allowed it to happen. The conviction provided a sense of order, a confirmation that actions had consequences even when decades had passed. He hoped that Rachel's case would inspire other families to continue advocating for their loved ones, and to trust that advancements in technology might eventually provide answers. The resolution of the case also had a profound impact on the community of Middleton Township. For those who had lived through the winter of 1987, Rachel Curran's disappearance and murder had been a defining event, a moment when the illusion of safety had been shattered. The arrest and conviction brought a sense of closure to the town as well, though it was tinged with sadness and a renewed awareness of how fragile security could be. The local library where Rachel had worked held a quiet memorial service in December 2021, marking the 34th anniversary of her disappearance. Community members gathered to remember her, to honor her memory, and to acknowledge the long journey toward justice. A scholarship fund was established in Rachel's name, awarded annually to a graduating senior from Middleton High School who planned to study literature or criminal justice. The investigation into whether Kenneth Dwyer might be connected to other unsolved cases continued for several months after his conviction. Detectives reviewed cold case files from across southern New Jersey, looking for cases that shared similarities with Rachel's murder. They focused on disappearances and homicides involving young women during the years Dwyer had worked for the county parks department. In early 2022, investigators announced they were taking a closer look at the 1989 disappearance of a 23-year-old woman from Evesham Township, whose body had been found in a wooded area similar to where Rachel had been discovered. DNA evidence from that case was being reanalyzed, and investigators were attempting to determine if there was a genetic link to Dwyer. As of late 2022, no charges had been filed, but the investigation remained active. The broader significance of Rachel Curran's case extended beyond the specifics of the crime itself. It became a prominent example of how genetic genealogy and modern forensic techniques were transforming cold case investigations. In the years following the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018, through similar methods, law enforcement agencies across the country had begun revisiting unsolved cases with renewed hope. Rachel's case demonstrated that even when evidence was decades old and investigative leads had long since dried up, justice was still possible. The case was studied by forensic science programs and cited in discussions about the ethical and legal implications of using consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. It highlighted both the power of these tools and the importance of using them responsibly and transparently. For Dr. Helena Marsh, the genetic genealogist who had played a crucial role in identifying Dwyer, the case represented the culmination of years of painstaking work and a validation of the methodology she and her colleagues had been refining. She continued to work on cold cases, applying the same techniques that had solved Rachel's murder to help other families find answers. She spoke at conferences and trained law enforcement personnel in the use of genetic genealogy, emphasizing that while the science was powerful, it required patience, precision, and collaboration between scientists and investigators. The story of Rachel Diane Curran is one of loss, persistence, and eventual resolution. It is a reminder that behind every cold case file is a person whose life was cut short, a family left searching for answers, and a community forever changed. It is also a testament to the dedication of investigators who refuse to let cases remain unsolved, who continue working even when leads disappear and years turn into decades. Rachel's case was solved not through luck, but through the methodical application of science, the courage of a witness who finally came forward, and the refusal of a family to let her memory fade. On winter evenings in Middleton Township, when snow falls softly over Birchwood Lane and the houses glow with warm light, those who knew Rachel Curran still think of her. They remember the young woman with the quiet ambition and the love of literature, the daughter and sister whose absence shaped so many lives. And they take some measure of comfort in knowing that justice, though long delayed, finally found its way home.